Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Feist, and I will be the host and presenter of the webinar, Accreditation Checklists for Dummies, How to Complete Them Effectively today. Our co-presenter is Paul Matera. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on Accreditation Checklists for Dummies. Please note we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics to cover at the beginning. All attendees are muted as they come in, and we will ask that if you have questions that you submit your questions via the Q&A box, and you'll find this on your screen at the bottom right-hand corner. It may have a question mark in it, or it may just say Q&A. Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about the presenters. Paul Matera currently leads the inspection body program for ANAB. He brings over 35 years of construction experience in the construction industry as an inspector, lab manager, quality manager, construction manager, and general contractor. Before joining the ANAB staff as a senior accreditation manager, he provided assessment services to several different accreditation bodies and industry groups, as well as consulting services for companies in many different industries that wish to get accredited. Myself, David Feist, I'm the former owner of China Sourcing Inc. I'm a lead accreditation assessor, ANAB accreditation manager, and I manage the ANAB training business. I've conducted hundreds of assessments across 17025 and 17020. I managed 13 laboratories while they attained their 17025 accreditation, and I'm a graduate of both Kettering and Xavier universities, and I serve on both financial and nonprofit board of directors. I'm going to turn this over to Paul Matera at this point in time.
Good
Paul?
morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name's Paul. So accreditation checklist, right? So what is that exactly? We look at it as a tool. It can be used for gap analysis. You can use it to conduct a self-assessment. You can use it as a template for your own internal audit, and we'll go over all of these things in more detail as we go. It's a clear, concise summary of what an accreditation body may ask you. So it's basically the standard laid out for you in a checklist format. And it's intended to be a guide for the documentation that you'll need for your accreditation. It should prompt you to seek out that information, verify that it's in place, that it meets the requirements of the standard, and that you understand it and how it's applied to your quality management system. And then, of course, it's another form to fill out, right? Because none of us are too busy to fill out yet another form. So we understand the time it does take for these, but hopefully what we'll demonstrate today is that the time is well spent. So these checklists, there's a lot of them. There's different ones for each accreditation body, for each standard. They primarily present a standard that we're evaluating you against in checklist format. Some accreditation bodies will quote the standard directly, verbatim. Others will turn these into questions. That's how ours are presented at ANAB. However, it's essentially the standard laid out as a tool to help you understand the requirements. And we try to do it in bite-sized pieces. So you'll notice on the checklist, if you have one in front of you right now during this video, which is encouraged, you will see that they're basically, they correspond to the exact requirement within the standard. So most of the standards that accreditation bodies have or use or work within, they have a checklist. And they all pretty much follow the same format. They're laid out kind of the same. So again, they have slight nuances and differences. At the top, at the beginning of a lot of the checklists, there's some instructions. There's a place for you to put your name and date and basically what the activity is you're using that checklist for. because as you'll see here in a minute, there's several different activities that you can use the checklist for. So, but they're all pretty much laid out the same. But we're here to help you navigate them and know how to successfully complete them. So some of you may be wondering, well, I'm attending a webinar put on by ANAB, but my accreditation body is not ANAB. It's another accreditation body. That's okay, because most of the world's accreditation bodies have to follow the same rules. Those rules are laid out by ISO 17011 and ILAC and others. If your accreditation body is what we call an MRA signatory, then they are all evaluated against the same metric and should be compatible for the most part with each other. And some of you may not know that, but yeah, we get audited too. So we feel your pain. We are assessed annually, just like you are, and we are evaluated against that common standard. So if your accreditation body is an MRA signatory, then they all probably have very similar checklists, and they're fairly compatible with each other. And that's done on purpose. So how do I get started? One of the things you'll notice is that at the top of the checklist and kind of peppered throughout some of the checklists, there is ILAC requirements. And the checklist also pretty much, for the most part, they present the shalls in pretty good detail. So you'll have shoulds and shalls, and you'll see that throughout the checklist. The ILAC requirements were created to are an example. Sorry. As an example, if you are accredited ISO 17020, ILAC P15 is also required to be complied with. They are represented in the checklist in slightly different ways depending on the accreditation body. They are there. So you're saying, what I'm getting accredited 17020. Why do I have to worry about ILAC? What is this about, right? So ILAC signatories agree to specific additional requirements. It's one of the MRA signatory that sort of comes along with that agreement. But it helps, again, to make sure that all the ABs around the world that are signatory are essentially globally equivalent. The areas in question will depend on the standard, like 17025. Proficiency testing is further defined. And ILAC expands on the core requirements of the standard. An example of this would be ISO 17020 clause 4.1.3, which states the IB identifies risk to its impartiality on an ongoing basis. ILAC P15 clause 4.1.3a states on an ongoing basis means that the IB identifies a risk whenever events occur which might have a bearing on the impartiality of the IB. So what ILAC tries to do, and I think does a pretty good job, is they take the clause within, in this case, 17020, and people will ask, well, what does an ongoing basis mean? I have to identify impartiality on an ongoing basis. Well, what exactly does that mean? How often is that? Is it every day? Once a year? So ILAC tries to say, they try to clarify that. So you'll see that throughout a lot of the checklists.
So Paul, would you say that it is intended as a clarification?
It is intended as a clarification in many regards. In some other regards, it would actually add an additional requirement. There are some areas where ILAC will say, in addition to the basic 17020 provision in this case, here are some additional requirements that you need to prove out that you meet that ISO standard, that clause. And you'll see that in the checklist. If you compare the ISO 17020 in this case, and I keep going back to that because I'm most familiar with that standard, and the ILAC P15, they are complementary to each other. So the ILAC requirements offer clarity to the core requirements. This also means that the assessor or the internal auditor, if that's who's using the checklist, should be able to document on the checklist how exactly these additional items are accomplished. We'll dive into that a little bit more shortly. So you might say to yourself, well, what do I need? These are things that you're going to want to have gathered up or have access to so you can get your checklist completed. Your top level documents, your quality manual, your procedures or SOPs, records that prove out that you are complying with the various requirements. So, you know, if the standard requires that you have a management review that you do annually, the record is going to be a copy of that management review, and you're going to need to have that because you're going to need to record some of that data on your checklist. People who know where to find all these things, right? And how they're filled out and how they're archived. Those people should be involved in the checklist. And most of the time, our checklists, I know they come in Word format. So you can fill them out on the computer, or if you're not comfortable with that, a lot of people print them out and write on them. We have assessors that are completely digital, and everything they do is on their iPad or their tablet, and it's all, you even sign with a digital pen. We have other assessors that'll show up with a lot of paperwork, and they'll sit there and they'll do the checks hand by hand. It's just whatever couple. Either way, it doesn't matter as long as the information is conveyed on the checklist to everybody that needs to read it. And so you start to look at these checklists and you're like, wow, this thing is huge. You know, and they can be quite lengthy, especially for some of the more in-depth standards. I know that our ISO 17025 checklist, for example, sits at 47 pages right now. A couple of those pages are taken up with the intro and some additional requirements at the end, but essentially it's 47 pages of checklist, and that can be a, when you first look at that, that can be a bear. However, just like any large task that you've got in front of you, if you break it down into sections, in this case, it's only 8 sections long. And the general approach that we usually recommend is to start with the section that you're the most comfortable with. You know, start there. And you'll find once you get into it, it's much easier to navigate. You'll start to understand what it says, where it's coming from, and how to fill it out. And just like any large task, once you start down that path, you'll find that it's pretty easy to complete. David, why don't you let's go over some examples.
Okay. So let's start with an example. And what we did was we just picked one of the requirements from 17025 at random. We chose 6.3.3, which says, does the laboratory monitor, control, and record environmental conditions in accordance with relevant specifications, et cetera? And you notice at the bottom of this, we've got a note that objective evidence is required. So let's talk about a practical way to do this. And what I want you to think about is with that question, which is a shall, it's a requirement of the standard in 6.3.3. I want you to think about answering that question 3 times or in 3 different ways. And one of the things that we find is that most people look at each question on the checklist as if they should be giving a single answer or just a short blurb or just, okay, it's in this area. And unfortunately, what that does is it just gives you really a base level of answer. So what we're going to do today, we're going to try and show you how to answer that question completely. What this is going to do is it's going to give you a checklist that once you're completed, you can be proud of this and you're going to be able to share it with the rest of your team, and you're going to be able to share it with your accreditation body. We like to view it as a roadmap for success in your internal audits, your external audits, your assessments, and you're going to learn and understand how your system works within ISO and within the ILAC requirements pretty completely. So The first way we want you to answer this question, and Paul and I, along with other accreditation managers, have talked about this at length. The first way we want you to answer this is, where do you say that you're going to do this? And remember, we're talking about section 6.3.3 here. So this is going to be your first answer. And it's likely going to be in your top level document. Some of you may call it a quality manual. Some of you may call it something else. And if you set your top level document in your systems up to parrot the ISO document, well, it's likely going to be in section 6.3.3 in your policy documents if it follows that standard. And that's a pretty good hint. Okay, so when you look at it and you say, where do you say you're going to do this? Your first answer might be, oh, it's in our policy document. Section 6.3.3 states, we will monitor, control, and record environmental conditions in accordance with, etc. And that's okay. So you now know where you say that, yes, we're going to comply with this shall in the ISO 17025 standard. And that's pretty powerful. But that doesn't say anything about, how do you say that you're going to do this? So, okay, you've said that you're going to do it, but then how are you going to do it? And that's what we want to be your second answer. And this is likely going to be somewhere in one of your procedures that says, hey, this is the process we follow through to do this. But I don't want you to think that you can just list out the procedure and say, hey, it's in procedure 1598. What we need you to do is we want you to be specific as to exactly where and how your procedure describes that you're going to meet this shall. If you do that, this document starts becoming very powerful. And so your second answer in saying how you will do this may be that you say, okay, how we do this is procedure 1598, monitoring of the laboratory, section 7.3.1.b through section 7.6.2.d, and also in section 7.8.6. And this also lists who is responsible for doing this. So wow, not only by answering these first two questions have you said, hey, this is what we say we're going to do. And the second answer says, hey, this is exactly how we are going to meet this requirement. And wow, you've just given yourself a lot of information. So, but you're saying, hey, David, you and Paul have said that we need to answer this question 3 times. What does that mean? So the third thing is, how do you show that you do this? So this is how we want you to answer it a third way. You know, now what we need you to do is show an example of this shall being met. And it may need to be a number of different items. You may need to include some records, some data, some photographs, those types of things. And that's going to give you this third piece. So when we show how you do this, that third answer might be something like, here are the thermometer and humidistat logs for the period of January to June of this year when this activity occurred. They were recorded by this individual in this place and are being stored at this specific location. So what have you done there? You've given 3 different levels of answer. The top level, you said, yes, we're going to comply with this. The second level, you said, hey, this is specifically how we do this. And the third level is, wow, this is an example of us doing this. Now, we won't lie to you and tell you that you can do these 3 levels of questions and answers for every shall in the standard, but you can do it for most of them. And we've done this personally. We've gone through and done this. And then you say, but hey, I've seen these checklists. Those text boxes aren't big enough for all that information. Well, guess what? Most of these checklists are a Word document. And if you want to write it down, longhand, use extra pages. You can expand those pages to have as much text and information as you need. It's great if you can hyperlink to some of the evidence. It's great if you want to embed the files. We're all about that. You know, this remember that this checklist, yeah, you're gonna want to give this accreditation checklist to your accreditation body at some point. But that's not really who benefits from it. You benefit from it. This is going to be something that you can use to train your people. This is going to be something that you can use to guide your internal audits. This becomes an exceptionally powerful document for you. And that's what we really want to get across. And so I'm going to pass this over to Paul right now. Paul?
Thanks, David. So the way that David just laid it out, some of you may be taken back a little bit. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of work we have to do. Um, it is. It is. It depends on how you're using the checklist and who the audience is. But if we're using it for an internal audit record, for instance, then you're going to want a lot of documentation on there because that's going to be evaluated later by the assessment team. But once you get through it, once you get it done, it's reusable and it's a pretty good tool. But if you try and do essentially it's the three whys, right? I mean, when we're answering uh, corrective action and doing a root cause, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, well, where is it specifically? Uh, how am I doing it? How is us as a company or an organization meeting that requirement? And what is the proof? And if you kind of get in that mindset as you're filling this out and working through your quality management system, again, you'll see that it gets easier and easier with
Yeah,
time.
and Paul, one of the keys is a lot of people look at the checklist and they say, well, this is so big. Split up this checklist, do it over different periods of time. Find who your experts in those areas are and teach them to do that. And just try to go through and repeat this process for every shall in the checklist.
Right. Okay, so you got through that. You're done. You're finished with that. You're going to put your feet up and have a cold glass of ice water and celebrate your victory, right? So then what happens now? Well, you've got a lot of stuff that you just accomplished. We've got some stuff here on this slide that you can see are definitely benefits. These checklists do change from time to time, especially when one of the standards gets revised. So using it over and over again, that has some caveats. Once the standard changes, or if your AB issues a revised, updated version, you'll just have to remember to transfer everything over to that new version. But typically, they don't change significantly. Um, the 2017 17025, those checklists did change significantly because the standard changed significantly. So there will be a time from time to time when you'll have to evaluate the template itself, that document, to make sure it still meets the needs for you and for your accreditation body. But again, typically once you complete it, you can reuse it over and over again. Um, they are typically submitted to your accreditation body every year as part of the requirement documents upload. Your assessor will use this completed checklist to conduct the assessment. It can also be used as a record for your internal audit if you wish, as we said before. One of the things your assessor will evaluate is if your internal audit has evaluated every component of your quality management system against the standard. So if you present this completed checklist that's filled out, well, as we're guiding you to do now, in the format of an internal audit record, it's very easy for your assessor to complete that part of the assessment. If you present the assessor with an in-house document, on the other hand, one that is not sort of formatted like the checklist, they now have to make sure it covered every aspect of the standard. So it takes a lot more time. This is one area where you can save your assessor some time, allow them to move on to other items quickly. You're also less likely to get a finding that you might have missed a part of the standard in your internal audit. So that's the other reason why these checklists can be very valuable is it helps. You're doing it anyway. You're spending the time anyway to complete this checklist for the purposes of your accreditation. So you are in essence doing an internal audit when you complete the checklist. So why not use it as that record that the assessment will ask you for during your internal audit? You just need to make sure you date it and you put that information on there that's required. So I mean, as we stated earlier, we've done hundreds of assessments. I've done hundreds myself. David has done hundreds. We have uh, managed a bunch of
Man,
different
we've
laboratories.
managed all different types of laboratories, yeah,
Yeah.
and to be honest, we've we've done this, yeah, in a lot of different ways and a lot of different wrong ways. We there are 100 different ways to fill out these checklists, and what we're trying to impart to you is one way that we've found that consistently works effectively. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's inexpensive. You don't have to bring in a consultant. You don't have to bring in lots of people. And at the end of the day, it works. It's quite effective.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of ways that it's done incorrectly too. I mean, that's just part of the job when you're managing assessments or you are doing assessments. We get checklists every day. Get manage hundreds of different labs, and they all have a checklist they filled out, right? And so some of them are barely filled out at all, and some of them are extremely detailed, and most of them are about halfway in between. So we've seen what works and what doesn't. So as we said earlier, gap analysis, it can be used for that. An internal audit tool. So yes, you can absolutely use it for your internal audit. Most accreditation bodies are more than happy to allow you to use the checklist as your internal audit record. Um, as your quality management system changes, you may want to record those on the internal audit version of the checklist you provide to help provide context and kind of as a record of what happened and how we got here. Because sometimes you'll change some things in your internal audit or in your quality management system, and if over time you're documenting those changes with some detail, this can be a tool to help you if you need to undo some things. You can figure out where you went wrong. Um, you also want to make sure you indicate who exactly conducted the audit. So, and we're using this in the context of if you're using this for your internal audit record, right? You want to indicate who did the audit, what the dates were that they conducted the audit on. Some companies split up their internal audit into sections. They'll do like quarterly. They'll do a quarter, a fourth of the standard. And so on your internal audit record, if you're using this checklist as that, you may want to indicate the dates over in the comment sections of what date range you did that part of the quality management system. Um, it gives credibility to the information presented in the internal audit record. Just be sure you have the version of the checklist for submittal that the accreditation body for the assessor to use and a separate one to be used as your record for the annual internal audit. You want to make sure that it's not the exact same one because there's different components. Also, when you're using this for internal audit, remember that part of an internal audit is to evaluate the items on your scope, and that's not necessarily laid out on this checklist, right? So just keep that in mind that you'll have to add some additional information that isn't already presented to you on your checklist to cover the scope portion. Okay. Now you may be asking yourself, hey, why do I have to do all this work? Isn't what the accreditation body is supposed to do? That's, you know, that's legit. Um, but what this is intended to do, as you've probably picked up by now, is for you to prepare for and evaluate your own quality management system yourself internally before your accreditation body gets involved in it, right? Because it's your company. the way you run your company or your organization is maybe different than how I do it for the same thing. So using the earlier example of um, 6.3 point, what was 3.3, right? Monitoring, controlling, and things like that. Was that, which one was that, David? That was 631, right? So
633,
633.
monitoring environmental conditions, etc.
Yeah, right. So then how I do that may be different than how you do that. And we each have to have a procedure that we've created that guides our staff and everything on how to do that. And so it's different for every company. So we are just evaluating what you're actually doing to comply with a given requirement, and then indicating as an independent third party that you are in fact doing it that way. So that would
And
require that you create that.
it
Go ahead.
is amazing because many times as we're going through as accreditation managers or as assessors, we'll find somebody doing something in a way that we've never thought of before. It's so creative. It's such a new way of doing things. So don't think that the way that Paul does something, the way that David does something is the right way. You can come up with something that's completely different, document it, and it's perfectly acceptable.
Right. Let's see. Right. And the checklist is a tool to advance the overall assessment process as far as possible. By the time that checklist is completed and you're ready to upload it to your accreditation body, you are so familiar with your quality management system that you are the authority on it. We are not. What we know is the standard and the requirements, but we don't really know how you, as an organization, meets those requirements. And so this tool is the vehicle uh, on how you inform us on how you meet those requirements. So information on that checklist is as clear and focused on the requirement as possible, and that's where the benefit is for you. We've all gotten into assessments, and for those of you that are already accredited and have been through an assessment, the assessment process with a well-developed checklist is much smoother than a checklist that has been barely filled out. It takes longer, which means, the fees are higher because a lot of us base our, stuff on man-days or whatever, but it just takes more time and therefore more cost. And so this helps keep things in check and keep things smooth operation. So how does this benefit me? Probably by now we've indicated that over and over again, but to recap, thoughtfully completed checklist can provide a smoother assessment of your findings, a gap analysis tool for you to use, an internal audit record, and a living document that may help you keep track of where your quality management system is where a given requirement is addressed. David.
Yes. And as we're going through this, I'd like to hear your questions from from this. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. There are additional resources that we have for you. Our webcasts are free. They're pre-recorded videos for you. Um, we also have webinars such as this. We cache every single one of our webinars on our website so that you can go back and reference these. In addition, these webinars will often link to blogs that we've posted. There's a blog that is specific to accreditation checklists that was posted in the last 48 hours. And we also offer training on each of these items. Uh, we don't specifically give one on how to fill out checklists, but we do give training on introduction to each of the standards, on internal auditing to the standards, on calculation of measurement uncertainty, on proficiency testing. All of those types of items are out there. Um, what questions do you have? We have about 10 minutes or so left, and we'll try to get through as many questions as you would like us to present. Do you have any questions? Please type them in the Q&A block, if you would.
So David, there are a few questions in there.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one, does 17025 require 100% of the standard be audited annually or at planned intervals, consistent with the importance with the activities? If a company is following 813B, how does this align with the requirements of the CL 2900 checklist? Let's see. So yes, essentially the short answer is yes, the entire quality management system has to be done annually. Um, some of the standards do allow you to stretch that out a little bit if you've got a documented history of very few findings during your assessments. You could work with your accreditation body to determine at what point that you guys are ready for that. But that is an that is an ability that you have with some of the standards. Some of the other standards require a 12-month or an annual, as it's said, and there is no other way. So you have to do it. You can absolutely do it in segments. Most bigger companies with a lot of operations do it that way. And it is required for the entire quality management system in each accredited location. And it does, as I said earlier, have to include technical review of your scopes. David, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think you've covered that very well. There is a question on the panel here that is there a link to the template checklist on the ANAB site? Yes, if you go in and you search for documents for 17025 or 17020 accreditation on the ANAB.org website, you will find our accreditation requirements, our supplemental requirements, and if you're working with your accreditation manager or with the business development manager at ANAB, they can send you a copy of the checklist. Those are documents that we want to have available to every one of the uh, laboratories or inspection bodies or proficiency testing bodies that we are working with. The templates themselves are not available to the general public. You have to be working towards accreditation with us, and then we will provide those to you free of charge.
Right. And as a senior accreditation manager, I can tell you that any of my inspection bodies or testing labs that have any questions on these checklists, um, they usually contact me and we get on a conference call together and a webinar or whatever, and we work through it and I help them out the best I can. So Paulette House has a question. How do you explain the training qualifications when you are a hired contractor as a metrology technician already trained from another company? So the requirement of the standards is that the company has to verify, validate, ensure that their staff is technically competent. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, but typically when you have an incoming technician um, that you're going to use in your accredited tests or accredited inspections or whatever, you have to verify that they know what they're doing. A resume can help, but the expectation is that you still verify that what they're saying on their resume is actually, valid. And so you would have to verify that. You would have them. There's an induction period that's required. It depends on what you're doing, which standard you're in. They all have a slightly different approach on the specific steps for verifying competency with your technician, but you have to, one good way to do it is to witness them doing an inspection or a test, things like that. Go ahead.
There is also, this is one of the reasons that when I've managed various organizations, I always try to make sure that the people that work with me get external certifications. So, for example, ASQ certified internal auditors or certified metrologists and have an external certification, because just because you're certified as a metrologist with Joe's Metrology Lab, that that isn't a known standard that transfers to another organization. So having an external certification always helps.
Right. And as an organization that has taken the time and gone through the effort to get accredited, you want to make sure that the people that are running your tests or doing your, providing that accredited service know what they're doing. So it depends on the standard as to how exactly you'd have to do that. 6.2 of 17025 and 6 in general resource requirements lays out some very specific things that you have to do that the assessor will look to verify you are doing in those cases. Um, I think that's the question. I'm not sure if you mean if I have a contractor performing this work for me, accredited work, versus I've hired a contractor, which I think is what this says, and now they're an internal employee and I'm going to use them to do these things. So there's slightly different things on how you would approach each one of those situations.
Okay, there's another question here. It says, can we section the ANAB checklist for internal audits? Absolutely. We're happy for you to use this and not reinvent the wheel. We're happy for you to add in your own questions. We're happy for you to split it up in any way. Don't forget, though, that you still need to do witnessing of the inspections or the tests that you're performing, that needs to be a part of it as well.
Right. For your personnel, there's sections in the standards that where the personnel have to be verified and on an ongoing basis at a certain frequency. And then the test method itself or the inspection itself has to be evaluated and validated or verified also. So it's kind of two different, slightly different things there. Let's see, Pete, if you use a third-party partner who is also ANAB accredited, did you still need to have a copy of their records, or is there being ANAB certified acceptance enough? So that would be a subcontractor, if I understand the question correctly. Um, and if you have a sub that you're using for overflow work to conduct an accredited inspection or test, they also need to be accredited to the same standard that you are, whether that be ANAB or A2LA or IS or somebody else. They have to be accredited to the same standard that you're accredited to for that test method or inspection. Um, and part of the subcontractor verification requirements in the standard is that you have records of that verification. So yes, you would need a copy. The assessor is probably going to ask you for a copy of proof that you evaluated the competency of that subcontractor. And a really good way to have that is to have a copy of their latest scope of accreditation from the accrediting body that they went with. So short
Okay.
answer, yes.
Short answer.
Short answer, yes.
Okay. There's a question here. Can you mention the different ways to export the report? Example, CSV, Excel, PDF, etc. This helps with continuity each year. Yes. We actually really like if you export it to us in Excel or in a Word document. If you want to export it in a PDF so that it doesn't get changed, that's fine. We just like the Excel or the Word version so that we can go through and add to it, make notations, etc. So, Paul, your thoughts on that one?
I love Word. Because what we do, guys, is we take that checklist, and then the customer document reference column that you filled out, where all of the information can be found, and that's actually something we really didn't go over too much in detail. Is this is also a tool for your assessor when he's doing his doc review before he gets to your facility to go through and pre-assess where that you have everything that you're supposed to. That way, when he's in the assessment itself, you're in the conference room or whatever, he or she does not need to go through those items again. They just need to do a quick verification on typically with records or a conversation that that's actually what's going on. it takes a lot less time. So if it's a Word version, um, that assessor can then use that as the basis for their document. They'll use yours as the basis for theirs, and then they'll fill in the comments and record the objective evidence. So I prefer Word.
Okay. There are a couple more questions. One is specifically about proficiency test providers for veterinary labs and checklists associated with veterinary labs. We have been dealing with that. I would encourage you to get in contact with Jason Stein or probably Patrick Seelig to deal with proficiency testing providers, and you can look those individuals up on the ANAB.org website for those proficiency testing providers and for the checklists that are specific to those.
And if you run into trouble, you have our contact information. You can reach out to either one of us and we'll help get you pointed in the right direction.
Right. And here's some contact information for us. You can always reach out directly to training@anab.org, and that comes into us, and we'll be able to answer any questions on training. And if there are any other questions, we encourage you to send an email directly to anab@anab.org, and that is for any general questions that you may have. There's also a question here on how to become a forensic auditor for the ANAB organization. I would encourage you to send an email to anab@anab.org, and we can go offline and discuss that process. Okay. And let's see, here's another question. I'm interested in learning more about your proficiency testing training. Um, you can email me at training@anab.org, and we can give you specific links, or you can also go on the ANAB website and look under training, and you will find proficiency testing training that is related to that and those subjects. There's also at least one free webinar that I know regarding that. Any additional questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending. Paul, thank you for being my co-presenter. And as we've said, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted likely within about 48 hours. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye, everybody.